Hello everyone and welcome back to Geotech Masters. In our last episode, we learned how to spot a discontinuity and tell the difference between a natural joint and the machine break. Today, we are going to get geometric. We are going to learn how to measure the position of these cracks in space. In this episode, we learned the universal language of dip and dip direction. This is critical because a joint that is flat is very different from a joint that is standing vertical. We will also look at how to measure these angles in rock core, which is a bit trickier than measuring them on a rock outcrop. And finally, we will learn how to classify the spacing between these joints. Let's get our compasses ready.
Before we start measuring, let's ask some key questions. First, how do we describe the angle of a rock face so that an engineer in an office can visualize it perfectly in 3D? We need a system that never fails. Second, have you ever seen numbers like 240/50 on a borehole log? What do they mean? Which number is the angle and which is the direction? We need to master this format. Finally, measuring a flat wall is easy, but how do we measure the angle of a fracture inside a cylinder of rock core that has been twisted and turned? We will introduce the concepts of alpha and beta angles to solve this. Let's define our terms. First, we have dip direction or dip azimuth. This is the compass direction that the slope faces. It ranges from 0 to 360 degrees. To determine the dip direction, we follow these steps on site. First, we specify the discontinuity plane, shown as the shaded plane in this figure. Then, we identify the discontinuity plane line on site. To determine the dip direction, we need to project it onto a horizontal plane. We can place our compass horizontally on top of it. For simplicity, we turn so that the north is in front of us. To identify the dip direction, we draw a perpendicular line demonstrating the direction of the deep plane, line 1. The clockwise angle between north and the dip direction line is the dip azimuth, or alpha. In this example, it's 240 degrees. We have dip, or dip angle. This is